I'm going to very briefly touch on the policy outcomes from the second phase. Became very, very interested nearing the end of the first phase about development path change and what constitutes and how can you measure change in a development path. So first of all, let's just review again what a development path is. A complex array of technological, economic, social, institutional, cultural, and biophysical characteristics that determines the interactions between human and natural systems, including consumption and production patterns over time at a particular scale. So it is certainly going to be difficult to determine what constitutes change in a development path, given the complexity and the number of actors involved in trying to change those. So in terms of second phase outcomes, and nobody's going to be surprised by this, unpacking change is difficult. It is deeply normative and has time dimensions. And there are ideological components to that. So some people would think it's transformative change to move to more nuclear energy. But if you're against nuclear energy, I mean, on the surface, of course, it looks very clean. But if you ignore the waste dimension to it, which I don't quite understand how, as intelligent beings, we got into that. But however, and then there are interesting time dimensions, which is related to the sense of urgency that you attach to the issue. So one of my doctoral students did a study of 3 highly conflictual natural resource cases here in BC. Over 100 interviews, pro-industry, pro-development, heads of associations, and environmentalists. Not surprisingly, she found that environmentalists thought the issue was far more urgent than some of the industrial people that she interviewed. So your sense of urgency then determines how much time you think you have to deal with the problem. So the people who think it's more urgent want to act immediately, and the people who think they've got another 20, 30, 40 years don't have that same time. And so this is sort of, for me, an interesting finding. And then how have we failed to communicate the urgency? And what I find interesting in the latest IPCC report is they have set a time limit. And they have moved from greenhouse gas reductions to referring to it as climate pollution. And the federal government, I've noticed in their language, is now using the word pollution, which people can relate to more. And it's interesting, too, because, of course, we know that Indigenous communities work in different time scales. So perhaps then the pace of change is another dimension. So all of the above determines the pace and the scale of change that people think are going to be necessary and how much support you are going to get for transformative change. Our interviewees in the second phase, you were unanimous that the pace of change, was too slow. So there are very important individually determined and personal determinants to the nature of change in development paths. The second, I guess, not surprising outcome we found, there is very little transformative change happening in development paths. And we developed out of that an assessment framework where we looked at incremental action. We defined 3 general categories for assessment: incremental actions, transitional actions, and transformative actions. An example in each category would be incremental energy efficiency, transition, carbon neutral buildings, transformative, carbon restorative buildings. So that's sort of an example of that continuum. So that's what we found generally from the second phase. So what does that mean? And I'm picking up a bit of what we found from the first phase here. All of these are necessary and sufficient for transformative change. Given the urgency of the IPCC report and how electoral changes can so influence the direction of development paths, I was shocked to hear that Doug Ford is actually dismantling. It's not enough that he's neutral to what has been done before. He's actually dismantling existing infrastructure and moving backwards. So we're now at a state in human evolution that we now have to intentionally intervene in development paths, and is going to take political will and many of the governance changes that we think are necessary. It has to be disruptive. We can no longer afford only incremental and transitional actions. It's going to take leadership, not just multi-level, but multiple levels interacting or interplaying. And we also have to determine what is the right level to intervene. And there's a positive interplay and a negative interplay. You're not going to be surprised by the first integrated plans and decision making. So some of the more innovative communities are those that have integrated their official community plan with their integrated sustainability community plan and their disaster management plan. The next one, policy congruence and policy coherence. This is critically important so that you have policy congruence within government departments and policy coherence between levels of government. Therefore, multi-level governance is essential for transformation. And I'd like you to think here about the pipeline, anti-pipeline that's building up, the contentious issues, and we have to move to multi-level governance. And it's going to be a hard task because it involves tremendous levels of collaboration. And I think we're going to have to learn new ways of collaborating to get ourselves out of where we are now. I am now firmly convinced that you cannot move to transformative change unless there are deliberate strategies in place so that the alternatives are clearly laid out. You get situations where we commit deeply to COP 2015, and then I think it was about a year ago that we announced a new coal mine in Cape Breton. And what's even more interesting is it was by an American company known for violating safety standards. So without transition strategies and without any policy coherence between levels of government, you are going to get us mired in the same extractive natural resource economy development path that we have been in since almost the very beginning of this country. So we also have found that from our research, the first phase in BC, clearly government policies and incentives can accelerate the take-up of climate actions. So I just thought I'd lighten it up a bit here. Without collaboration, with collaboration and transition strategies.